Chapter 13, Introductions. This chapter was called, The Fool. In fact, most of the Pentos arc was practically me using chapters from a fanfic called, Game of Thrones, The Prideful One, as a template. When I started the story, I had no intention of publishing it, so I didn't care where the words came from as long as they expressed my idea. Now that I've progressed, I feel obliged to rewrite the scenes to make them absolutely mine. But don't worry, the plot won't change much, as it will still follow the series closely. Thank you all for your readings and your understanding in this. The sun was beginning to set over Pentos when the sound of hooves echoed across the cobblestone courtyard of Illyrio Mopatis's mansion. The Targaryen siblings waited at the top of the stairs, surrounded by columns and fine cloths that fluttered in the breeze. Viserys looked impatient, his purple cloak flowing behind him, while Daenerys remained silent beside him, watching attentively as the main gate opened. Illyrio stood among them, sweaty despite the shade, visibly nervous about the meeting. He had no doubt that Vlad would keep his promise to kill him if the young princess did not meet his expectations. The Blood Riders were the first to enter, tall men with stern faces and cold gazes, armed, wearing no armor but belts that decorated their shoulders, on which fine furs rested. It was the first time Illyrio had seen Dothraki dressed decently. Unlike the savagery that usually accompanied the Kosars, their march was orderly. They looked more like trained soldiers than barbarians. The black horse that closed the formation was tall, with a shiny coat and firm steps. Riding on its back was a man with broad shoulders and strong arms that stood out even under his clothes. His pale blonde hair fell in a simple braid down his back. He wore black leather pants and a white silk shirt that contrasted with his pale skin. "That's Vlad," Viserys murmured to his sister, leaning slightly towards her. "Do you see how long his hair is? When the Dothraki are defeated, they cut it so everyone can see their shame. Vlad has never been defeated. He's a savage, of course, but one of the best living assassins. Besides, all sorts of stories circulate about him. They say he has never been injured and that he impales his enemies." Daenerys, already nervous, tried to remain steady but couldn't stop a shiver from running down her spine. The man's eyes locked with hers. He didn't look her over like other men usually did, but instead held a strange intensity, as if he could see through her skin. Illyrio took a few steps forward and raised his voice with his usual theatricality. "I present to you His Highness Viserys of House Targaryen, the third of his name, rightful king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm." Vlad lifted his chin, staring seriously at the two young people before him. Viserys was scrawny and rather disappointing. His hair was less shiny than his sister's, just like his eyes. And his sister, Princess Daenerys of the Storm, of House Targaryen. Vlad dismounted without a word, with fluid and elegant movements, and walked toward them with measured steps. His riders stayed in formation, motionless. He stopped a few steps from Daenerys, paying little attention to Viserys, and studied her for a moment. Her hair was an almost unreal silver, and her eyes, a light violet, reflected nothing but fear. It was clear she didn't want to be there. She was still just a sheltered girl, nothing like the woman she would become in the future. "Princess Daenerys," Vlad said, bowing his head slightly. "You are more beautiful than the rumors say. It's a pleasure to meet you." His voice was deep, calm, and masculine. The tone was polite, and he maintained eye contact the entire time. Daenerys blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected the man, whom they associated with savages and dark rumors, to speak with such refinement. Viserys, somewhat annoyed at being ignored, spoke, trying to steer the conversation. "Impressive. He speaks the common tongue better than I expected." Vlad turned his head toward him, not wiping the faint smile from his lips. "And you speak it better than I expected." "Prince," Vlad said, intentionally emphasizing the title. The comment was so subtle that, for a moment, no one knew whether it had been a compliment or an insult. Viserys frowned. "I trust you are pleased, Vlad. My sister will undoubtedly be happy to become your wife, especially if it means recovering what is rightfully ours," Viserys said, pushing Daenerys forward as if she were a commodity at a market. Vlad cast a glance at Illyrio, deliberately ignoring Viserys, then returned his gaze to Daenerys. "I accept the deal," he said calmly. "If she agrees to be my wife, I will make House Targaryen sit once again on the Iron Throne," he added solemnly. Daenerys seemed surprised when her opinion was asked. She didn't want the marriage, she only longed for a home she didn't even remember. Viserys immediately spoke up. "Of course, she accepts, Vlad. My sister will be more than happy to be your wife, especially if it helps us recover what is rightfully ours," he said, pushing her a little to make her speak. "I want to hear her say it." Vlad interrupted him sharply, his tone cold and cutting. The girl was nervous in front of Vlad, the difference in size was almost comical, but despite the fear, she didn't dare refuse. She didn't want to wake the dragon, as Viserys had warned her many times. "It would be an honor to become your wife, call Vlad," she murmured, her voice trembling. Illyrio clapped lightly with a laugh, while Viserys smiled in satisfaction. "How wonderful to see you both finally reunited. Come in, I have prepared a banquet worthy of my guests." Vlad cast one last look at Illyrio, then returned his gaze to Daenerys. Then, he added without breaking eye contact, "Future wife, let's dine." With a nod, he turned and walked into the mansion, followed by Illyrio and his blood riders. Viserys stayed at the door, almost fantasizing about the throne he would reclaim, while Daenerys watched the figure walking away, her heart beating faster, unable to help but feel a little relief. At least the man she was being forced to marry wasn't the savage she had imagined. The dinner went smoothly. Daenerys, though still anxious, felt somewhat calmer thanks to Vlad's manners and attitude. He didn't seem different from a knight of Westeros, maybe just a little more severe. He was polite to her and addressed her directly, unlike the others, who spoke through her brother. Viserys, on the other hand, was offended. That barbarian did not treat him with the respect he was due, not even offering him a gift. To him, it was clear that despite his manners, Vlad was nothing more than a well-dressed barbarian. Still, he forced himself to endure and smile. Once he had his army marching over Westeros, he could reclaim the throne and be treated as he deserved. In fact, he thought Vlad would be easily replaceable. When the war began, the soldiers would see his incredible leadership skills and obviously choose to follow him without hesitation. After all, he was the true king. Chapter 14, The Dothraki Wedding. This chapter was originally called, The Wedding. In reality, most of the Pentos arc was practically me using chapters from a fanfic called, Game of Thrones, The Prideful One, as a template. When I started the story, I didn't intend to publish it, so I didn't care where the words came from as long as they expressed my idea. Now that I've made progress, I feel compelled to rewrite the scenes so that they are entirely my own. But don't worry, the plot won't be much different, as it will still follow the series closely. Thanks to everyone for your readings and your understanding in this matter. In the months that followed, Vlad became a guest once again at Illyrio's mansion, and the initial tension gave way to a more pleasant routine. Over time, Daenerys began to relax in his presence, growing more comfortable during their walks through the gardens and the afternoons spent sharing wine and conversation. Vlad was an eloquent man when he wanted to be. He spoke to Daenerys about his battles, the years he had spent in the Dothraki Sea, and how he had awakened there with no memory, barely clothed in a tunic. Of course, he omitted the part about remembering his past life, but even without that detail, his story was fascinating. He told her how, after defeating the Khal in combat, he had to fight even harder to earn the respect of his men. But now, everyone respected and feared him. He didn't say it with pride or boastfulness, it was more as if he wanted to teach her a lesson. Perhaps that's why Daenerys listened intently, as if there was something important in it for a reason she didn't yet understand. Vlad tried to skip over the part where Daenerys should have been broken so that she could mature, not because he suddenly loved her, but because he didn't have time. As the days passed, her objections to the marriage began to fade. Vlad wasn't just handsome and enigmatic, he was also someone who treated her with respect. Daenerys, accustomed to being treated as a bargaining chip or a burden, for the first time felt like a person. He didn't look at her as a prize or possession, but as herself, as if the respect he showed her was the most natural thing in the world. That simple gesture was enough for her to no longer feel as much fear when imagining a future with him. Vlad noticed her change in attitude and continued his subtle courtship, giving her gifts such as books about the histories of great rulers, hair ornaments, and even assigning former Valyrian slaves to serve as her handmaidens. He didn't forget to comment to Mera and Alyssa to instruct Daenerys in the complexities of being a woman and a wife, as he doubted Viserys had properly educated her in those matters. Viserys, on the other hand, became increasingly insufferable. Unable to stand that the attention no longer centered on him, he paraded around the mansion with airs of grandeur, boasting about his impending invasion of Westeros, about how he would crush his enemies and claim the Iron Throne, almost as if he were already fighting on the front lines. He was often heard making disparaging comments about Vlad when he thought he couldn't be heard. His attitude became more childish as the time for preparations dragged on, and his tantrums went from pathetic to annoying. When the 100 riders Vlad had summoned for the wedding arrived, the presence of those warriors seemed to especially offend Viserys. He felt overshadowed and, in a desperate attempt to prove his superiority, ended up in a duel. During a training session, while making moves with a wooden sword with the coordination of a dead fish, he allowed himself to mock the poor swordsmanship of the Dothraki warriors. One of them, who understood the common tongue, took this as an insult and challenged him to combat. The confrontation was brief and humiliating. Viserys fell to the dust in 3 moves, his chest bruised and tears in his eyes. Vlad intervened before the warrior could do him real harm, but still, Viserys whined and demanded that the head of that savage be brought to him. But it seemed that humiliation wasn't enough to shut Viserys up. In the following weeks, he dedicated himself to complaining about his horrible battle wounds, showing off his bruised torso as if he had survived an ambush. His complaints were constant, and every dinner became an opportunity for him to recount how, after a brutal duel, he was wounded by an opponent who used dirty tricks to defeat him. At that point, Vlad just wanted him to shut up. He was about to ask if they could speed up the wedding preparations if it meant finally getting rid of the endless whining of the beggar king. Luckily for him, the preparations were completed a week later, leading to a Dothraki-style wedding. The wedding took place in a vast square on the outskirts of Pentos, where hundreds of Dothraki gathered to honor their Khal in his new Khaleesi. A Dothraki wedding required no vows or priests. It was enough for a man to claim a woman before all. That was sufficient. There were no chairs or elaborate decorations, just carpets spread over the earth, colorful tents, and bonfires scattered everywhere. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of roasted meat. The drums began to beat loudly, marking a primitive rhythm that soon gave way to dancing, shouting, and the first fights. Men and women danced without shame, engulfed in wild and violent movements. Some women, semi-naked, twisted their bodies to the frantic beat of the drums, while drunken warriors punched each other amid laughter or broke wine jars over their companions' heads. The spectacle was raw, noisy, and savage. Daenerys sat beside Vlad, visibly uncomfortable. Her eyes darted away every time a dancer removed her clothes and began to move as if putting on a show for everyone, or when 2 men began to wrestle for the right to mount a woman. Her elegant dress, custom-made by Illyrio, only accentuated the contrast with this wild environment. Vlad, on the other hand, appeared unperturbed. Dressed in black with a dark red cloak draped over his shoulders, he watched the celebration with a slight, almost indulgent smile. One by one, the blood riders, captains, and even merchants from Essos approached to present their gifts: swords, saddles, wine pitchers, leopard skins, candied dates, and even a bronze crown. Vlad accepted each gift with a few words and a nod. Finally, Illyrio approached with his heavy and ceremonial gait, accompanied by a couple of servants carrying a black wooden box. With both hands, the Magister presented it to Vlad. "Am I lord, am I lady?" he said in a hoarse voice, looking Daenerys in the eyes. "Dragon eggs, Daenerys, from the shadowy lands beyond Ashai. They have petrified, but they will always be beautiful," he announced grandly, nodding to Vlad, signaling that this was his part of the deal. Vlad accepted the gift, his gaze lingering for a moment on the eggs while he watched Daenerys caress them with fascination. Illyrio bowed slightly and withdrew, just as a scream echoed above the noise. 2 men, who just a moment ago had been fighting for the dubious privilege of taking a dancer in the middle of the square, began a battle, crossing their weapons with the intent to kill. One of them quickly emerged victorious, cutting the other across the stomach, causing him to fall as his entrails spilled onto the ground. Daenerys visibly recoiled in disgust. "I see that, like me, you do not appreciate the subtleties of Dothraki celebrations," Vlad commented with irony. Daenerys blinked before replying with sincere discomfort, for she had learned that with Vlad, she could speak freely. "Yes, well, it's rather indecent." Vlad chuckled softly. "It's no different from what men do in Westeros, Daenerys. Only there, they do it behind closed doors," he shrugged. "Men bleed for money, women, or glory. It is the women's task to contain our stupidity." Illyrio, however, responded to the prince, who was shocked to see a man die before him. "A Dothraki wedding without at least 2 deaths is considered boring, my prince." Before Viserys could retort, a man dressed in dark leather approached. Stocky, with a short beard and a weathered face, he wore a sword at his side. He bowed before them with respect. "A small gift for the new Khaleesi," he said in a deep voice, handing over a bundle of books tied together. Stories and songs from the Seven Kingdoms. Daenerys looked at him in surprise, showing genuine interest for the first time. Thank you, Esser. Are you from my land? Yes, my lady, Esser Jorah Mormont, from Bear Island. I served your father for many years, he replied proudly. He then turned toward Viserys, who watched him suspiciously, and added courteously. May the gods allow me to continue serving the rightful king. Viserys nodded haughtily, clearly pleased to receive the respect he thought he deserved. We thank you, Esser Mormont, Vlad interrupted abruptly, fixing his gaze on the man. He knew exactly who he was and what he sought, but for now, the knight could be of use to him. The celebration continued for some time. Vlad, though he did not appreciate unnecessary deaths or unchecked savagery, understood that he could not expect Dothraki men to change so quickly. Not yet, at least. When the moment arrived, Vlad calmly stood to retire to his wedding tent. With a subtle gesture, he indicated for Daenerys to take his hand. The women had already prepared the interior with soft furs and a bit of privacy for the newlyweds. A pity that Vlad had plans to consummate the marriage with a frightened girl. But still, he had to make it seem as if he would. Although Daenerys had become less reluctant to the marriage and even found some attraction toward Vlad, a wave of terror flooded her as she understood the meaning of that gesture. What girl wouldn't have felt the same? Alyssa and Mara had had a talk with her, explaining the mechanics of what the marriage entailed. And yes, Daenerys was terrified. Even so, gathering all the courage she could, Daenerys took Vlad's hand with her eyes fixed on the ground, ashamed, as they walked through the human corridor the guests had formed to let them pass. The festivities still raged in the square as Vlad led Daenerys to the wedding tent. Outside, the drums kept pounding, and the laughter and shouting of the Dothraki filled the night. Inside, however, silence reigned. The tent was dimly lit by oil lamps, and the air smelled of incense and furs. Daenerys entered with hesitant steps, her eyes fixed on the interior. She sat on the edge of the bed, made of thick furs and cushions, and remained there motionless, hands clasped in her lap and shoulders tense. She was breathing fast, eyes lowered, clearly on the verge of panic. Vlad watched her in silence for a few seconds. Then, with a soft but firm voice, he stepped a little closer. You can be at ease, he said at last. I have no intention of sleeping with you tonight. Daenerys looked up abruptly, her eyes wide as saucers. She opened her mouth to say something, but it took her a few seconds to find her words. But Viserys insists that we must, she stammered, swallowing hard. To seal the alliance, Vlad let out a short, mirthless laugh. Viserys lost any right to decide over your life, he answered calmly, stepping closer until he stood before her. You are my wife now. And he would do well to remember that. His words struck like cold water. Daenerys stared at him, mouth open, unsure if she should feel offended or relieved. She lowered her gaze again. Even so, I am your wife. You should just do it, she said softly. Vlad crouched in front of her, so close their faces were only inches apart. Sex can be something tremendously pleasurable, Daenerys, he whispered. But only if both people want it. Otherwise, it's a farce. Or something worse. She looked up again. For a moment, their eyes met, and the tension shifted. It was no longer fear, but something harder to define. Confusion, perhaps, and a hint of curiosity. Then, what should we do? She asked in a very low voice. Vlad leaned in closer, and his lips brushed hers slowly and gently. It was a soft kiss, almost innocent. Daenerys felt goosebumps rise on her skin. Sleep, he finally replied after pulling away, with a faint smile. Before she could react, he carefully scooped her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He laid her beside him on the bed and wrapped an arm around her, drawing her to his chest. She remained stiff at first, confused, disbelieving, her heart pounding in her ears. I don't understand, she began, not really sure what she was asking. Go to sleep, Daenerys, Vlad murmured, closing his eyes as he spoke. We'll talk about this when there's no pressure. The warmth of Vlad's body, the silence of the tent, and the accumulated tension of the day began to take their toll. Slowly, Daenerys's eyelids grew heavy, and her breathing steadied. Within minutes, she had fallen asleep in his arms. Vlad, on the other hand, remained awake a while longer. He stared at the fabric ceiling of the tent, thinking of nothing in particular, and let out a long sigh as he felt the weight of his new wife resting peacefully against him. After a few more minutes, he finally closed his eyes and allowed sleep to take him to Chapter 15, The Descent. This chapter used to be called Checkmate. In truth, most of the Pentos arc was practically me using chapters from a fanfic called Game of Thrones, the Prideful One, as a template. When I first started writing the story, I had no intention of publishing it, so I didn't care where the words came from as long as they expressed my ideas. But now that I've progressed, I feel the need to rewrite these scenes so that they're entirely my own. Don't worry, though, the plot won't change much, since it will still follow the show fairly closely. Thank you all for reading and for your understanding. The days in Pentos passed quickly and peacefully for Vlad. His marital situation with Daenerys hadn't progressed much, but the girl seemed genuinely happy with her new life. Even though she preferred a more luxurious lifestyle, she was determined to adapt to the Dothraki way. She rode nearly every day, accompanied by her guards, and personally went out to purchase whatever supplies the camp needed. It must be said that although the Dothraki were barbaric and brutish, they did not disdain her efforts. In fact, the men who had brought her along seemed to genuinely appreciate her, whether for her looks or her personality. As for Vlad, he spent his days calmly, continuing to study the ritual to awaken the dragons. He had summoned his horde to come to Pentos to resupply before departing for Vaes Dothrak, so he had almost 3 months of margin before they arrived. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to please the boy king, who complained loudly and incessantly, demanding that the men arrive sooner. Vlad barely restrained the urge to slap him. How did he expect his men to travel faster across the continent? By flying. Viserys' constant whining was becoming increasingly annoying, and he was often seen having secret conversations with Illyrio about how Vlad wasn't holding up his end of the bargain, and that it would be quicker to find another way to get in. Army. Vlad chose not to interfere with these pathetic conspiracies, because in truth, Viserys was nothing more than a weak and ridiculous man. So he continued with his routine. All was going well. A week after the wedding, Vlad met with his men in the courtyard to drink and celebrate. Celebrate what? It didn't matter. The men simply wanted an excuse to relax, and Vlad didn't mind being a little more permissive. He sat surrounded by his men around the fire. Even Jorah Mormont, who had coincidentally entered Daenerys' service, was among them. Viserys and Daenerys herself drank quietly amidst laughter. Jorah and the Blood Riders were having a lively debate about whether the arak or the sword was better, depending on the situation. Jorah defended the sword, arguing it was more versatile and designed to pierce the joints in armor. Talon, one of the Blood Riders, considered wearing armor to be cowardly, claiming it made any warrior slow. But when Jorah pointed out that armor could also keep one alive, Talon couldn't argue against it. Vlad watched the scene with a smile and a cup of wine in his hand. The men seemed content, and that was enough. Jorah leaned slightly toward Daenerys with a warm smile on his lips. "I must admit, my queen, you've learned to ride quite quickly," he said as he raised his cup. "You're doing well, the men will respect you more for it." Daenerys laughed modestly, then spoke in broken Dothraki. "I'm not a queen, Jorah. I'm a Khaleesi, and a Khaleesi must know how to ride." The men around the fire, mostly Dothraki, looked impressed by the little queen who was learning their language so quickly. Perhaps it was the wine, but they decided to toast to her. They were delighted that their new Khaleesi was integrating so well, despite her appearance. "And you're learning Dothraki quite fast," Jorah added with a chuckle. Talon nodded in approval, while another rider clanged his cup against a metal bowl of roasted meat in a gesture of recognition. Viserys, who had remained quiet until then, tensed upon seeing his sister surrounded by praise. He drank quickly, without enjoying the wine, as if needing an excuse to tolerate the scene. The compliments toward Daenerys were starting to push his patience to the limit. "What's so great about learning the language of these savages?" he snapped, already half drunk. "You bow to her like she's some whore from Lee." Silence fell instantly. Even the riders stopped laughing, and Vlad glanced at him from the corner of his eye without moving, one eyebrow barely raised. Vlad was about to make a remark, but Daenerys spoke first. "Be careful how you speak of them, brother. They are my people now," Daenerys said softly, without raising her voice. Perhaps the wine had given her some courage. The comment hit Viserys like a slap. He stood up so quickly that he knocked over his cup, spilling wine on one of the riders' tunics. "How dare you give me orders? Do you think you're something now because you're queen of these savages? I am the dragon. The dragon. How dare you speak to me like that?" he shouted, eyes bloodshot and his hand trembling as he pointed at everyone. No one replied. The Dothraki looked at him with a mix of disdain and amusement, while Jorah lowered his gaze in resignation. "Mind your tone when speaking to my wife, boy," Vlad said in a calm, soft voice, but his eyes promised pain. Viserys knew that arguing with his sister was one thing, but Vlad was another matter. So he merely scoffed, turned awkwardly, and walked off, muttering to himself. The feast continued even after Viserys left. There was a bit of tension at first, but it soon melted into the soft rhythm of drums, Dothraki chants, and the scent of roasted meat. Vlad didn't drink, but smiled pleasantly each time the riders raised their cups in honor of their Khaleesi. Daenerys, still blushing from the earlier scene, seemed more determined to show strength in front of everyone. But as the night wore on and the fire began to wane, Daenerys stood, wiped her hands on a cloth, and stepped away from the circle without saying a word. Vlad saw her leave but didn't stop her. The camp, now quieter, was bathed in shadow, lit only by slowly burning torches. Daenerys walked quickly, though her chest was tight with emotion. Her brother had always been irritable, but she wanted to make peace. After all, they were family. She reached Viserys' tent. The curtain of fabric was slightly open, revealing shadows inside. She paused, then pushed it aside gently. Viserys was on his knees, hunched over an open chest, hastily stuffing the 3 dragon eggs into a leather bag. Daenerys blinked, not immediately understanding what she was seeing. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. Viserys jumped, turning awkwardly. He was sweaty, pale, and glassy-eyed from the wine. "Oh, it's you," he spat. "I'm leaving and I'm taking the eggs." "Are you insane?" She stepped forward, alarmed. "What do you want them for, to sell?" "Yes," he shouted with a crooked, dangerous smile. "I'll sell them, buy a ship, and pay for an army. Vlad hasn't kept his end of the deal. He said he'd gather his men and we'd have our throne. But there's no one, nothing." "The men are coming," Daenerys replied, trying to stay calm. "They're on their way. Be reasonable, brother. Don't give me orders," he snapped, waving his free hand. "Don't defend that savage. He's brainwashed you. He's got you playing house while I have nothing." "You can't take the eggs," Daenerys said, stepping back. "Vlad will kill you if you do." "Don't give me orders." Viserys stood up, swaying, his face twisted with rage and wine. "I am the dragon. I am the true king and that savage should bow before me." Suddenly, he drew his sword, pointing it toward Daenerys, making her gasp in fear. "Come with me," he said abruptly, the tip trembling as it moved toward her neck. "We'll go back to Braavos. I'll marry you to some rich noble. Someone who knows his place. Not that beast who has you under a spell." "I don't want to marry anyone else," Daenerys whispered. "It doesn't matter what you want." Viserys stepped forward, and the sword tip grazed her neck. It wasn't intentional, just a clumsy movement from his drunken state. But it was enough to leave a small cut that started bleeding immediately. Daenerys gasped, bringing a hand to her neck, eyes wide with shock and fear. Viserys froze, as if finally realizing what he'd done. Then the atmosphere changed. The torches flickered once, then began to go out one by one. The wind howled suddenly, lifting dust and making the tent fabric tremble. The shadows stretched, vibrating as if coming to life. Viserys looked around, confused, swaying. What is this?" Suddenly, Vlad appeared out of nowhere, his face twisted with rage and his golden eyes glowing like fire. Before anyone could say a word, Viserys felt as if a hammer had smashed into his face. Chapter 16, Ruthlessness as Mercy Upon Ourselves. This chapter used to be titled, Conspiracy. In truth, most of the Pentos arc was essentially me using the chapters from a fanfic called, Game of Thrones, The Prideful One, as a template. When I started this story, I had no intention of publishing it, so I didn't really care where the words came from as long as they expressed my idea. But now that I've made progress, I feel obligated to rewrite the scenes so that they are entirely mine. Don't worry, the plot won't be too different, as it will still follow the series closely. Thank you all for reading and for your understanding. Vlad remained motionless for just a moment, watching the blood trickle down Daenerys' neck. Without a word, he crossed the distance between them and struck Viserys with enough force to break something, but not kill him. The first punch shattered his cheek, the second split his lip, the third broke his nose with a sickening crunch. Viserys fell to the ground, but Vlad didn't stop. He knelt over him, grabbed him by the hair, and raised his head just enough to slam his fist into his face again. And again, blood splattered the floor, and several teeth flew. "Vlad, stop," Daenerys cried, throwing herself toward him and grabbing his arm with both hands. "Please, stop." Vlad looked at her, his face twisted with fury, his eyes red. For a second, he didn't seem to recognize her, but then his fist loosened, though he didn't rise just yet. You're a fool, Daenerys, he growled, his voice hoarse and deep. If you think your mercy is well spent on this man, then you're an idiot. That bastard wouldn't hesitate to sell you to a brothel if it meant he could reclaim his throne. He doesn't love you. Daenerys trembled, tears running down her cheeks. She pressed her lips together before whispering, "He's my only family." Vlad turned his face toward her, his expression hardened. "Not anymore," he said coldly. "I am your husband now. And I swear by all that is sacred, I will burn to ashes before I allow that bastard to touch you again." She sobbed, lowering her gaze, but knelt beside him, her voice breaking with anguish. "Please, don't kill him. Not like this. I don't want you to be the cause of his death. If that happens, I'll never be able to forget it." Vlad took a deep breath, his fists tense, his whole body still trembling with fury. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he slowly stood up. Viserys, bloody and disfigured, barely managed to sit up. He muttered something unintelligible, though the arrogance still flickered in his half-closed eyes. Vlad approached him calmly, with absolute contempt in his gaze. He crouched down and whispered a single word. "Fall." And Viserys dropped to his knees instantly, unable to understand why his muscles had betrayed him. Vlad kept his voice low, almost intimate. "If you ever try to harm your sister again, your heart will stop on the spot." At that moment, several men entered, alerted by the commotion. They froze at the sight, tense. "Take him away," Vlad ordered, not taking his eyes off Viserys. "Tend to his wounds, and then lock him up. In a cell where he'll eat what livestock eats. That will be his crown now." The men nodded, dragging away the unconscious and battered prince. Daenerys stood beside Vlad, her tears still fresh. She gave her brother one last look, then turned and slowly walked away. Vlad watched her go, still tense, his hands still stained with blood. Then he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Ruthlessness is mercy upon ourselves, Daenerys, you'll learn that soon." Then he simply walked away to clean himself. Vlad returned to his tent in silence, his face clean but still furiously tense. Not with Viserys, but with himself. How could he have been so foolish? He had assumed that the events he knew would unfold in the same sequence as the original timeline. He should have known that, in reality, someone as unstable as Viserys would be completely unpredictable. How naive, how arrogant. He entered his tent without bothering to raise the threshold curtain too much. The place was dark, save for the dim glow of a few candles. He pulled off his blood-stained shirt, tossed it into a corner, and put on a clean tunic without bothering to tie it. Daenerys was lying on the bed in silence. She looked asleep, but her eyes were open, fixed on the figure that had just entered. Vlad said nothing. He didn't want to disturb her further. He simply moved to his worktable, picked up a few scrolls, and began preparing what he needed to continue the ritual. At this point, it was a good way to relax. Then he felt her approach. Daenerys walked slowly, completely naked, her feet bare and her hair cascading down her back like a waterfall. She slid up behind him and embraced him from behind, wrapping her arms around him, her warm breasts pressing against his back, her breath soft and warm against his skin. Vlad didn't turn around right away, but spoke in a low voice. "Are you all right?" He received no answer, only silence, and the warmth of her body. Then, with quiet insistence, Daenerys turned him around in his seat. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a timid kiss, but a deep one, hungry, full of longing. Vlad held her by the waist and kissed her back with passion, but still stopped, trying to restrain her. "You're not thinking clearly," he murmured against her lips as she reached for his belt, undoing it. "You've been through too much today." Daenerys didn't stop. She looked into his eyes with a mix of tenderness, heat, and that stubbornness so typical of her. "I need you," she whispered. "Please, help me forget." Vlad closed his eyes. He could say no, he could be rational, but he knew she wanted him, she needed him, and even if the timing wasn't ideal, she had asked for it. That was enough. He kissed her again, this time without hesitation. His arms wrapped around her completely, he lifted her effortlessly by the hips and carried her to the bed. If Daenerys wanted to forget, then Vlad would give her a night that would make her forget even her name. And so they spent their first night as husband and wife, lost in moans, gasps, and the muffled cries of the last Targaryen princess. Chapter 17, Good Wife. The night passed quickly. Daenerys had changed her behavior since she woke up that morning. She was kinder, more prone to physical affection. She hadn't suddenly become a loving and devoted wife, but it was clear that she felt more comfortable with him, seeking his touch naturally. Vlad, for his part, continued roaming Illyrio's mansion, dedicating himself to perfecting the ritual with the help of his spellbook. His plan went beyond simply awakening the dragons. He intended to imbue them with his essence and, at the same time, absorb some of theirs. In theory, this would not only grant him the fire immunity typical of dragonblood, but it would also strengthen the creatures, since his own existence was essentially blood and magic. As for Daenerys, her role in the ritual remained uncertain, or whether she even had one. Vlad knew she wasn't a chosen one whose blood was essential for the process. The Valyrians had started as humble shepherds. It was the magic that bound their blood to that of the dragons, and there was no reason why he couldn't replicate it. The problem was that, for now, he simply didn't know how. He could take his time to study the matter, or simply include her in the ritual. Her blood could act as a bridge and a catalyst, and he might even gain some benefit from it, like an increase in his magical abilities. Meanwhile, his wife was making an effort to stay busy. He often saw her walking through the hallways while he read, bringing him snacks of her own accord or quickly removing his cloak when he returned from his walks. Vlad was almost moved. The young woman seemed genuinely trying to be a good wife. At those moments, he was almost sure that the poor girl simply longed to cling to the only man who had treated her like a human being. He understood that codependency was far more believable than love that appeared out of nowhere. In fact, he had considered sleeping with her again in a few days, just to see how she would react. But apparently, the girl had other plans. Days before he could do anything, she decided to confront her husband. The door to the study creaked open. Vlad didn't look up from his spellbook, but he recognized the soft rustle of Daenerys' sandals on the floor. "Do you need something?" he asked, turning a page. She didn't respond immediately. She stood there in the doorway, visibly nervous. Vlad could hear her quickened heartbeat and smell the fear emanating from her skin. Finally, she spoke, in a voice lower than usual. "Don't you like me?" Vlad paused, his fingers halting over the scroll. Slowly, he looked up. Daenerys remained tense, her lips tight and shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for a blow. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, but her eyes, those violet eyes, didn't look away from his. "Where did you get that idea?" he asked, closing the book. She swallowed hard. You haven't tried again." The words got stuck in her throat. Vlad understood. Ah. He leaned back in the chair, watching her. The fragility of her posture was almost painful to witness. "It has nothing to do with you, Daenerys." She frowned, as if the simplicity of that answer didn't convince her. "Then why?" "Because I didn't want to rush you," he interrupted gently. "I thought you'd prefer some time to adapt. The other night was very nice, but you were in mourning, not thinking clearly. So I thought I'd give you time to reconcile." Daenerys blinked, perplexed, as if the idea of someone offering her time was absurd. I am your wife," she murmured, as if that explained everything. "And does that mean I can't treat you with respect?" he replied with a playful smile, but she didn't respond to his humor. Vlad understood her insecurities. In this world, the concept of consent simply didn't exist. If a husband wanted sex, it was accepted, whether his wife wanted it or not. But he was different. Killing on the battlefield and his behavior in daily life had nothing to do with each other. Vlad lived by a simple phrase: nobility obliges. "It's my duty," he insisted, though it seemed more like he was trying to convince himself than her. "And if there's something I should change or do differently." Vlad stood up with a fluid movement. She didn't step back, but her breathing became shallow as he approached, stopping just a step away. "You don't need to change anything," he said, raising a hand to caress her cheek. She held her breath. Vlad knew exactly what his touch did to her, and he enjoyed it. "But if you insist on fulfilling your duty." The irony in his voice was unmistakable. Daenerys, however, nodded seriously, too embarrassed to meet his eyes. Vlad let out a chuckle, half amused, half exasperated. "Very well." He gently took her wrist. "Let's go." She barely had time to protest before he led her down the hallways, straight to the master bedroom. When the door closed behind them, the nearby servants scattered quickly. Minutes later, the first muffled moans from Daenerys echoed against the walls. After that night, Vlad's married life turned out to be surprisingly pleasant. Daenerys proved to be a passionate lover, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy spending entire afternoons receiving his attention. Vlad attributed this to the lack of sexual creativity among the lords of Westeros. Usually, the only ones who knew what they were doing in bed were the prostitutes, while the powerful nobles focused solely on producing as many heirs as possible. So, while he waited for the arrival of his Kosar outside the city, Vlad found himself juggling between perfecting the ritual and pleasing his wife. Anyone could guess which activity he preferred. But all good, things must come to an end. Several days later, his men finally arrived, and Vlad went out to meet them, accompanied by his Khaleesi. Their Kosar had arrived, nearly 30,000 men. Obviously, Pentos was in turmoil, but Illyrio made sure that panic didn't spread. After all, they were leaving. One of his blood riders stepped forward and bowed as they approached the group. "Call, Khaleesi, what do the scouts say?" Vlad asked. "Clear path ahead, blood of my blood," Talon replied. "Make sure everyone is ready. We march at dawn," Vlad ordered, then took his wife's hand to lead her to a more private place. "How do you control all this?" she asked, looking at the camp. Vlad smiled and responded with another question. "Have you ever wondered how someone like me managed to gather a Kosar of 30,000 riders without having to fight for leadership every day? I know I have presence, but that alone isn't enough. I'm not Dothraki." She tilted her head. "Yes, I've wondered. You don't seem as cruel as the bards say." "The answer is simple," he said, raising a hand. "I wield my sword with the same ease with which I wield magic." Vlad drew a dagger from his belt and spun it in the air. Before it fell, flames engulfed it without consuming it. "Fear is useful, darling. But magic is a universal language that every man fears," he said, extinguishing the flames with a gesture of his hand. And with that revelation, Daenerys' world changed just a little more. Chapter 18, The Knowledge of the Immortals. As soon as he finished speaking, the objects inside the tent began to levitate, floating around them in a hypnotic dance. Jewels, vases, and trinkets gently spun through the air, obeying his will. Daenerys widened her eyes, not in fear, but in absolute awe. Vlad smiled at her reaction and decided to show her more. "I am the ultimate warrior, Daenerys," he said in a deep voice. "I am faster." Before she could blink, he had already vanished from her sight, moving from one end of the tent to the other in the blink of an eye. Stronger. He grabbed a spear resting near the entrance and, without effort, bent it with his bare hands. "All thanks to magic. And with it, I will conquer this continent, and the next." He stopped right in front of her, fire dancing between his fingers as if it were an extension of his arms. Daenerys looked at him with shining eyes, surprised, excited, and aroused. Without warning, she threw herself into his arms, kissing him with intensity. "Can you teach me?" she asked in a soft, eager voice. He smiled against her lips, letting himself enjoy the moment. "Of course, my dear." After spending several hours enjoying each other's company, Daenerys couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer and began to bombard him with questions. Vlad, unhurried, answered most of them. He spoke of some of his abilities and shared part of his plans for Essos and Westeros. And when he mentioned he knew a way to bring dragons back, the princess's excitement was so intense she nearly managed to drain a vampire dry. The journey to Vaes Dothrak was about as exciting as watching grass grow. To pass the time, Vlad taught Daenerys how to throw knives, and she told him stories about Westeros, her childhood, and dragons. Days later, they finally arrived at standing before the massive gates of Vaes Dothrak, known as the Horse Gate. According to what he had read, it was the most imposing thing in the whole city, and honestly, he had to admit, they weren't lying. The two colossal bronze stallions loomed over them, their hoofs brushing the sky, forming an arch that looked like the entrance to a legendary world. There was something almost mystical about their presence. "Not bad at all," Vlad murmured as he rode beneath the arch on horseback. "The tails don't do it justice," added Daenerys, riding at his side, her gaze still fixed on the statues. Beyond the majestic arch, Vaes Dothrak was nothing more than a slave market with absolutely nothing special. Mud huts clustered around smoking fire pits, half-naked children ran through piles of trash, and the air reeked of horse piss mixed with rancid spices. "Next time, I'll believe the books a little less," Daenerys whispered, wrinkling her nose. "Smells just like the stories," Vlad joked, covering his nose with a cloth. To be honest, the jewel of Dothraki culture was little more than a slum. The only difference from a regular Dothraki camp was that here, they didn't kill each other at every opportunity. It was almost endearing that the barbarians respected the sanctity of the place. Of course, their arrival didn't go unnoticed. In this timeline, Vlad commanded one of the largest Kosars of all. The problem was, his appearance didn't go unnoticed either. Though he often went shirtless, his obvious hygiene and lack of a braid made sure that, a few days after his arrival, the Dashkolene summoned him. Naturally, Vlad had plans, so he agreed to see them, not without leaving behind 2 blood riders, newly turned vampires, to watch over Daenerys. The Dashkolene awaited him inside the temple, surrounded by a circle of braziers emitting thick, aromatic smoke. Vlad entered without flinching, walking with firm steps, braidless and without escort, but with a presence that filled the room like a tangible shadow. The old women watched him with disdain the moment he crossed the threshold. "You are not Dothraki," spat one of them, a hunched woman with a cutting voice. "Are you a lost boy who stole a Kosar of weak men?" Another stood up, pointing at him with her bony fingers. "You reek of foreign magic. And your skin is pale like the dead. You are an omen. Misfortune will fall upon all who follow you. The gods will punish the false call. He shall be chained and sold," added a third, met with murmurs of approval. Vlad let them speak. He stood in the center of the temple, unblinking, with his arms crossed behind his back. He said nothing, not a single word. The crones kept on with their insults, growing bolder, spitting on the ground. They were quite creative, actually. Then, without changing his expression, Vlad extended both hands, just a subtle gesture, like caressing the air. "Silence. And do not move." The effect was immediate. All the women froze in place, as if an invisible wave had swept through the temple. Their lips clamped shut, their bodies tensed, and their eyes widened to the limit, trapped within themselves. Only their heavy breathing and the frantic pounding of their hearts revealed they were still conscious. Vlad walked among them calmly, a relaxed smile curving his lips. "Relax," he said in a soft, almost paternal voice, "I won't hurt you. Not yet. I need you." He stopped before the spokeswoman, the oldest of them all, the one who had dared point at him. With a light flick of his wrist, her eyes lost their light. She was now under his complete control. "Tell them you've had a vision," he ordered, his voice turning into a whisper that echoed softly in the woman's mind. "Tell them the gods spoke to you, and that all the Kosars must return to the sacred city. A great prophecy is about to be revealed. Every call must come, with his blood riders, his warriors, and his weapons." The old woman nodded, stripped of will. Vlad stepped back, and with another flick of his hand, the rest were released from their paralysis. Some dropped to their knees, gasping, others stared at him in pure terror. "Thank you for your attention. You will not speak to anyone about what happened here. You will lock yourselves inside this temple and ask for food to be brought to you. You will give no explanations, and see no one, until all the leaders have arrived," Vlad said, turning with elegance to leave the temple. "Oh, and one last thing." He stopped for a moment before crossing the threshold, without looking back. "From now on, you will show respect when you address me. Enjoy your final days." And with that, he left the temple. Chapter 19, Dothraki. Vlad's stay in Dothrak was surprisingly pleasant. He spent his time in his tent, in the company of Daenerys, enjoying pleasant meals as they talked about anything and everything. He had shared his plan with her and kept her informed about the massacre that was coming. The poor girl, of course, had expressed concern for his well-being and asked him to consider a more reasonable and less violent alternative. Vlad laughed as he kissed her forehead. The thought that he could conquer anything with words was adorable. As for the preparations, he didn't need much. Really, if he wanted to, he could destroy any army on his own. What army of men could stand against him? The problem was the waiting. Just the messenger's journey would take weeks, then more weeks for the Kosars to prepare, more time for them to set out, and even more for them to arrive. If it weren't for the need to carefully prepare the runic sets for the ritual, he would have died of boredom. The only positive point was Daenerys, who was becoming more and more open with him, talking freely, even making jokes and showing a tendency to seduce him of her own accord, which he enjoyed. After all, what man didn't like to feel desired? After almost 2 damn months in that pompous flea market, the horse lords finally began to arrive. Vlad could see the clouds of dust raised by the riders from a distance and practically hear their war cries. There were at least 90,000 men, divided into at least 15 Kosars. Vlad was thrilled. At the end of the day, they would be his men. Or corpses. After spending a couple of full days setting up camp around the city, the leaders of the Kosars finally entered Dothrak, each accompanied only by their blood riders and Khaleesi's. Vlad didn't even bother to ask their names. He simply prepared his own blood riders and Daenerys for the ceremony. The leaders of the Kosars entered one by one into the temple, their firm steps resonating on the stone. In the center of the room, the Dashkolene were gathered around a large bonfire, their faces tense, their expressions neutral, all were under Vlad's compulsion. He was already there, ahead of everyone. Sitting in one of the chairs set aside for the calls, he waited patiently for them to gather around the fire. The eldest of the women raised her hands and, with a trembling voice, proclaimed. "The great stallion has spoken to us in dreams," she announced. "The one who will ride the world is here, among the 16 calls who honor this sacred land." One of the warriors, a man broad as a bull, furrowed his brow. "There are only 15 calls gathered here," he pointed out the obvious. Vlad stood up. The darkness that seemed to cover his position lifted as if a torch had dispersed it. "I am here," he announced, holding his scarlet witch, the Valyrian steel sword. The Dashkolene suddenly blinked, as though waking from a long sleep. The same elder who had announced the prophecy pointed at him with a trembling finger, her eyes filled with dread. "It's a demon. He used vile sorcery to control us, to make us call you here." "Kill him," another one cried. "Bleed him dry and bury his body before he condemns us all." Chaos threatened to erupt. Some calls were already reaching for their weapons. But Vlad didn't move. He simply looked at his blood riders and ordered calmly. "Protect her," he said, referring to Daenerys, who watched from a corner with a furrowed brow and held breath. Caron and Nork immediately positioned themselves by her side, their vampiric senses alert to everything around them. Vlad turned his gaze to the rest, one by one, without hurry, as if he already knew exactly what was going to happen. "I challenge each of you," he then said, his tone laden with disdain. "Here and now, for the leadership of the Dothraki." "Kill him," roared the youngest Khal, almost frothing at the mouth. "Surrender," ordered another, older, with cold eyes. "You're surrounded." Vlad practically smiled, savoring the moment before responding. "The only thing I'm surrounded by is fear." He then looked at them all and continued in a calm voice. "And dead men." And then, they all attacked at once. Nearly 30 men. The Khals, their blood riders, all leaping from their seats and charging at him with a crash of steel and war cries. For an instant, the world seemed to freeze. The fire from the bonfire cast shadows against the walls as the warriors charged towards Vlad. But for him, everything happened slowly, as if time itself had yielded to his will. He saw clearly the gleam of each drawn blade, the tightening of muscles, the sweat beading on brows, the steps raising dust in slow motion. He inhaled deeply. The air smelled of leather, old blood, wood smoke, and fear. His body moved fast. He took one step, just one, but it was enough to dodge 3 blows. He twisted his torso, tilted his neck, and felt the blade of an axe brush his hair without reaching his skin. Another strike came from the right, descending, but his left arm rose with precision. He caught the attacker's wrist and broke it with a sharp twist before plunging the man's own blade into his neck. "One," he whispered to himself. A rider lunged from the side with a spear, aiming to pierce his flank. Vlad spun on his foot, caught the spear with his bare hand, and dragged the man towards him as though he were a toy, then propelled him into another man charging with 2 short swords. The spear's point pierced the second man's chest before both fell. And then, without looking, he threw his sword upwards. The blade spun unnaturally in the air, turning upon itself as Vlad dodged an axe swing under the elbow of another enemy and slid between them as though it were all part of a carefully rehearsed choreography. One enemy attacked him from behind, thinking he had the advantage, but the sword spun in the air, deflecting his blade with a metallic ring. Vlad caught it mid-flight with his free hand and drove it into the throat of another. The circle didn't close. They fought in a group, surrounding him, but he had already killed 4 men in less than a second. His long blonde hair moved with every turn. Vlad kicked the body of a dead man with such force that it sent it crashing into 2 other riders. One fell. The other was caught by a hand that grabbed his neck and slammed him against a pillar. 3 more, one with a mace, another with curved blades, and a third with a long spear. Vlad advanced. A mace was dodged with a minimal movement of his head. Vlad's hand sank into the enemy's chest as though the flesh were clay. With a yank, he lifted him and used him as a shield against the following blades. He then threw the man at the center one, spun on himself, and dropped his knee onto the third's neck, breaking it. Blood soaked the stone, and Vlad felt it. Without even turning, he extended his senses, and the blood pooled under his feet rose like reddish threads. At his command, they solidified and, like spears, pierced the legs of the riders trying to flank him. Only when they fell did Vlad stop moving. The last 5 looked at him with a mix of fury and fear. The ground was covered in bodies, hot blood, and broken bones. Vlad breathed calmly, as if all of it were nothing more than a well-rehearsed dance. He rested the tip of his sword on the ground. The Scarlet Witch, as though following an unspoken command, stood perfectly balanced. "You are calls, warriors of the Great Stallion. Honor your name." And the last ones charged, shouting. Vlad smiled. The Scarlet Witch rose from the ground as though moved by his hands, but it was not so. As fast as lightning, it spun on itself, dancing among the last men standing. Valyrian steel, the metal that cuts through anything, sliced through the trembling necks of the former barbarian leaders, now terrified after Vlad's display, until the last of them fell. Then, there was only silence. A minute had passed. Chapter 20, Call of Calls. Daenerys remained standing in a corner of the temple, protected by the 5 blood riders, almost as tall as Vlad, who stood firm, ready to strike down anyone who dared approach her. But there was no need. Their broad shoulders didn't allow her a clear view, and yet she could still make out Vlad's figure, moving with the grace of the most gifted dancer in Pentos. He wasn't moving particularly fast for a man, and yet he dodged every attack as if he could see them coming before they were even thrown. Daenerys saw him take a spear from one enemy and use it to impale another, then spin and leap to break the neck of a third with the motion of his fall. She had never witnessed anything like it. Vlad made killing look like a dance, as if each movement was part of a choreographed performance. And Daenerys felt her knees tremble as she saw him standing there, facing the last 5 warriors still alive, less than a minute into the fight. Vlad said something, but Daenerys didn't hear it. She couldn't. She could only look at him, mesmerized. She had never seen anything so horrifying. She had never seen anything so beautiful. His broad, powerful back. His immense arms, tensing with every movement. His bare chest, covered in blood that, instead of repulsing her, made him seem even more imposing. He was brutal. He was majestic. She wanted him right then and there, without delay. But the fantasy shattered when Vlad spoke. "Daenerys," he called, shaking her gently. Yes, sorry. Did you say something?" She answered, startled, blushing to the tips of her ears. "I asked if you were all right." Vlad looked at her in a strange way. After all, he could smell what the little princess was thinking. Yes, I'm excellent. You fought incredibly," she replied, and though she seemed to have regained her composure, her expression made it clear she was deeply impressed by Vlad's performance. Vlad just raised an eyebrow at her before turning to his blood riders. "Talon, take her to the tent. Protect her at all costs," he ordered. "As you command, blood of my blood." Vlad then turned toward the temple doors, but not before making a gesture toward the Dashkolene, who were huddled in a corner, terrified. Controlling their blood, he stopped their hearts in unison. It was the least they deserved. After all, they had saved him nearly 2 years of war by gathering all the calls in one place. What followed wasn't a particularly pleasant annexation. Vlad presented himself to each of the calls' camps with the head of their leader in his hands. He made it clear that he had defeated him in combat and that, by right, all their armies now belonged to him. Needless to say, the Dothraki were not pleased. Whether because of his appearance or a desire for revenge, many attacked, alone, in groups, many declared themselves new calls, many tried to kill him. They all died. For 2 weeks, Vlad focused solely on eliminating anyone who refused to follow his command. He did not allow any man in his army to intervene. He did it all by himself. Each challenger was impaled on a 3-meter-high wooden spike, driven deep into the ground, leaving their body suspended in the air as a silent warning. 20,000 men impaled was the final count. Of the nearly 90,000 scattered across the various camps, 20,000 formed what would henceforth be known across Essos as the Forest of the Dead. No one opposed Call Vlad anymore. Every man in his horde followed him with that unusual blend of respect and fear that only a Dothraki could feel. Then came logistics. Organizing so many men was a difficult, full-time job, but at least Vlad could count on the help of his blood riders, and even Daenerys, who proved surprisingly skilled at managing parts of the immense horde. Naturally, Vlad needed to establish some rules. He made it clear: no killing children, and no rape. The barbarian horse lords seemed especially offended by the latter, as if it were an essential part of their culture. For them, looting and rape were rites of conquest as natural as drinking water or riding a horse. But a quick walk through the Forest of the Dead was enough for their complaints to turn, quite suddenly, into cooperation. King's Landing. Robert Baratheon barely paid attention to the first messenger who brought the news. He spoke of a man who bathed in blood during battle and impaled his enemies, a man who had filled the landscape with impaled corpses numbering in the thousands. Still, a problem on the other side of the world didn't interest him in the slightest. But when Varys presented a more detailed report on what was happening in the plains of Essos, the king shifted in his seat with an expression of annoyance. "Are you telling me some damn foreigner has gathered all the Dothraki under his command?" he growled, gripping the arms of his chair with hands barely visible beneath his large belly. "Not exactly all of them, my king," Varys replied with his signature enigmatic smile. "But his army already exceeds 100,000 riders. And it seems his Khaleesi is none other than Daenerys Targaryen." Robert fell silent for a moment before hurling the wine cup he had been drinking from to the floor. "The girl, that dragon spawn, now she's married to some demon from Essos." Even across the sea, the stories of the Impaler had reached them. Ned Stark, seated to his right, frowned with visible concern. "The Dothraki have never crossed the narrow sea. They have no ships, nor do they seek them." His voice was firm, but Varys raised a finger before he could continue. "True, but Vlad Dracul is not a Dothraki. He has proven his capabilities. He's unified the riders through discipline and terror. You've all heard the stories of the Forest of the Dead. Tales to frighten children," Pycelle interrupted with disdain. "My little birds confirm them," Varys insisted, though he could see most still believed it was just a story. Renly let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "The Dothraki following rules? That's a first." "Indeed, my lord," Varys nodded. "And not only that, he's established contact with merchants in Pentos and Myr. He's resupplying, quite generously I must say." Robert slammed his mug onto the table, splashing wine across the cloth. "To hell with the merchants of Essos. If he sets one foot in Westeros, I'll crush him." But Ned wasn't convinced. He knew his friend had a nasty habit of underestimating his enemies. "It's not just Daenerys. 80,000 unified riders, reorganized, it's more dangerous than you think." "What if he acts under Viserys' command? They could be preparing an invasion." Robert scoffed, brushing the matter aside. In his mind, there was no reason to fear anyone from Essos. "Keep us informed, Spider, and bring me more wine. I'm the king, damn it," he growled, quickly losing interest and moving on to the next item on the agenda. Chapter 21, Reactions. At Castle Rock, Tywin Lannister read the report in his private study with an impassive face, setting the parchment aside after finishing it in full. Kevin, at his side, waited for a comment, but the Lannister patriarch merely closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. 80,000 riders, well-trained. Led by a man we know nothing about, but who has the last Targaryen as his wife. Kevin nodded, folding his arms. "And they say he cannot be wounded." Tywin barely spared him a glance. "Men always say foolish things when they don't understand something. Do you think he'll cross the sea?" Tywin remained thoughtful, weighing his words carefully. "If he does, Westeros will have to unite to face him. But I don't think he's that foolish. Not yet. And what will we do? Wait, watch, and if the time comes, profit from it, as we always have." His voice held no fear, only pragmatism. If Vlad Dracul became a real threat, he would deal with him as he had dealt with many others before. In Highgarden, Olenna Tyrell listened to the news with a cup of wine in her hand and an expression of disbelief, while her son Mace appeared visibly skeptical. "So now we have some impaling monster conquering the other side of the world," Mace scoffed. "Bard's exaggerating again." Olenna, however, was far less relaxed. "If the rumors are true, this could shift the balance of power in Essos. And if Daenerys Targaryen uses those savages to fight for the throne." Mace waved a hand dismissively, not even bothering to consider the possibility. "Bah, let the man do whatever he wants in Essos. If he sets foot in Westeros, let the Baratheons or the Starks deal with him. We have other priorities." Olenna rubbed her temples, once again wondering how she could have raised such an idiot of a son. If it weren't impossible, she would have thought her husband had been unfaithful. In Sunspear, Doran Martell listened to the news while staring out at the sea from his balcony, the sound of the waves echoing through his thoughts. "Vlad Dracul," he whispered, testing the name on his lips. "A new player in the game." Areo Hoda, by his side, remained silent, but his expression was cautious. "They say he has banned the killing of children and rape in his army," Hoda continued. "An interesting man, not a typical Dothraki." Doran nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on the armrest of his chair. "No, he seems more like a conqueror." Hoda nodded in understanding of the prince's train of thought. "Let's see if he wants more from the last Targaryen than just a wife. If he fights for the throne, we might support him." Doran kept his gaze on the horizon, remaining silent for a long time before giving his final order. "Keep me informed." 2 months later, Sea of grass. The ritual would take place on the night when the full moon stood at its zenith. In the center of the camp, a circle marked with ash and salt surrounded a massive pyre, fed by wood that crackled fiercely. Atop the fire, arranged on an iron altar, rested 4 dragon eggs, one black with crimson veins, another deep black with silvery reflections, a red one glowing with orange hues, and the last one a dark green with bronze shadows. Around the altar, 8 Dothraki prisoners and mercenaries captured during Vlad's campaigns knelt with their hands tied and their eyes blindfolded with blood-stained cloth. Silence reigned, broken only by the crackling of flames. Vlad stood at the center of the circle, his bare chest covered in runes. Drawn in blood, written in High Valyrian according to the ancient instructions from his book. In his hands, he held a Valyrian steel dagger, using it to trace runes into the ground with his blood, all lines converging toward the center of the circle. Beside him, Daenerys watched the scene with a solemn expression, wrapped in a white dress that billowed in the wind. Her eyes, fixed on him, showed concern at how much of his blood the ritual demanded. When the silence became absolute, Vlad spoke. His voice was a deep whisper, like thunder resonating in the bones of all present. It seemed like a song, a melody in High Valyrian that sounded more like a dark lullaby than a spell. Taking the dagger, he stepped toward the first prisoner and, without hesitation, slid the blade across his throat. The blood gushed in a hot stream that Vlad directed toward the eggs. The fire seemed to blaze higher, dancing in more intense golden and red tones. A second prisoner fell, then a third. With each death, the fire roared louder, as if it fed not only on the wood. Vlad felt the heat enveloping his body, the magic seeping into his flesh, into his blood, into his bones. When the final sacrifice was made, Vlad raised the dagger and, without flinching, plunged it into his own palm, and then into Daenerys's. The girl winced, holding back the pain as the blade cut her skin. Their blood dripped onto the eggs, hissing as it touched the scalding surface. Then, he looked at Daenerys, and with a somber smile, they joined their bleeding hands. "Come," Vlad said softly to his wife. She hesitated for a moment but then nodded and stepped forward, her steps steady despite the crackling fire. Together, they entered the pyre. The heat was unbearable, a searing sensation that pierced the skin and burned the innards. Vlad forced himself to stay upright, his body resisting, even as his skin burned and his muscles tensed under the pressure of the flames. The fire licked his arms and chest, leaving charred marks on his flesh, though his regeneration slowly began to counteract the damage. Daenerys, on the other hand, remained untouched, her silver hair flowing in the fiery wind, her eyes fixed on the eggs, as if she could feel something awakening within. Then, it happened. A crack, like distant thunder, echoed from the heart of the fire. One egg fractured, then another. A blinding light burst from the cracks, and a primal screech, a sharp, ancient sound, rose above the roar of the flames. The dragons began to hatch. Chapter 22, Ritual. Vlad fell to his knees, feeling the searing pain of his wounds, his scorched skin, and his body exhausted from the effort of containing the agony. The ritual consumed both magic and blood, and he, a creature born of both, felt weak, slow. The magic he had invoked was draining his energy, as if the very essence of his were being absorbed by the fire. Daenerys knelt beside him, her expression filled with concern. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. She had never seen him injured before. He let out a hoarse laugh, revealing blood-stained fangs. "I'll heal, with a little blood," he replied with a smile that failed to reassure her. The newborn dragons crept closer, their small, steaming bodies climbing over the remains of the pyre, nuzzling their parents with their snouts as they nestled around Vlad. Vlad turned his gaze toward his blood riders. "Bring me Alyssa and Mara," he ordered, referring to the former slaves he usually fed from. Normally, they also served as Daenerys' handmaidens. But Daenerys stopped him. With an expression full of worry, she extended her wrist to him, her hand trembling slightly. "There's no time, you're still bleeding," she said, voice breaking, her eyes filled with anguish. Her hand shook as she brought her wrist to his mouth. "That's not necessary, my dear," Vlad said, trying to stop her, but she cut him off with a pleading tone. "Drink, please," she begged, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You did this for me, so please, you already have my heart. A little blood is nothing." Vlad looked at her, seeing the pain reflected on her face. He didn't have the strength to refuse her. Without another word, he kissed her gently, then bit into her neck with practiced precision. Daenerys let out a soft moan of pleasure, a sound that clashed with the gravity of the situation, but it held not a trace of pain. At that moment, her body experienced the ecstasy of the bite, an ecstasy that, for a vampire, could be as intimate as sex when shared between lovers. Daenerys felt it firsthand, completely intoxicated by the experience. Vlad was also overwhelmed by it. He had drunk a great deal of blood in his life, but he had never tasted anything as exquisite as Daenerys' blood. It was intoxicating, like drinking after years lost in the desert. Fortunately, Vlad maintained control and drank only enough to stabilize without harming her. When he pulled away, he looked deeply into her eyes, and saw no pain, only love. "I love you," he whispered. 2 words. His voice was barely a whisper, yet to Daenerys they echoed like a thunderclap. She hadn't realized how much she had longed to hear them until that moment. She wanted to answer, but the knot in her throat left her speechless. Instead, she held him tightly, embracing him and their newborn dragons. And in that instant, she knew with absolute certainty that when Vlad swore eternal love, it was a true promise. The next day, Vlad found himself curled up in bed beside Daenerys and the 4 dragonlings. Rhaegal, named in honor of Daenerys' mother, Rhaella Targaryen, was a deep emerald green dragon. Balerion, named after the Black Dread in hopes of earning similar reverence, was the black dragon who, in another life, would have been Drogon. Vladion, named in honor of his father, was a coppery red dragon, as both shared the same flesh and blood. Lastly, Dracul, who took his father's surname as a name to immortalize it, was a black dragon with blood-red shimmering scales. From the moment they were born, the dragons were quite spoiled, chirping and demanding attention at all hours. No matter which way Vlad turned, he'd find them climbing up his legs, demanding his full attention. He couldn't deny it, he found them absolutely adorable. Daenerys was overjoyed to see them and have them by her side. She radiated happiness, caressing and showering the newborn dragons with affection. They weren't just pets, they were family. Even so, she insisted that Vlad remain in bed for a few days, drinking regularly to recover. She made sure Alyssa and Mera donated blood whenever they could, though Vlad still felt somewhat weak. He explained that the ritual had been harder on him because he had to draw the magic from his own body, something deeply unpleasant, but a few days of feeding would fix it. He also explained that if she ever wished to become one of his kind, she would have to undergo a similar process. It wasn't exactly a ritual, but making a partner was different from creating a spawn. He could sire as many spawn as he wanted, they were little more than followers, slaves if he willed it. But a partner was an equal. To create one, he had to give her his blood essence, the very core of what defined him, allowing her to be reborn as his own blood. As a consequence, he would be left weakened for months while she adapted to her new nature. Needless to say, Daenerys found the idea incredibly romantic. Vlad figured it was time to have the talk, so he explained the full extent of his powers. He told her how they would live eternal lives, about their strength and speed, how they could change form, become mist, and even influence others' minds, but also about how they would watch every human friend and family member die. Daenerys was heartbroken, her thoughts immediately turning to her future children, nearly deciding to reject immortality. However, Vlad calmed her. He explained that for their kind, conceiving natural children between equals was extremely rare, but thanks to the enchanted pendant he had created, they could have as many children as they wanted. They would be strong and inherit only the best of both parents, living long lives like their mother and father. Then, he confessed his plan. He intended to grant her the gift of eternity once they had conquered the Slaver's Bay, so that when they finally reached Westeros, nothing could harm her. He also revealed the true threat looming over the world, the Night King. He told her how, little by little, this enemy was gaining ground beyond the wall, and how every fallen soul became one of his soldiers, mindless, tireless, and immune to pain. In that moment, Daenerys understood why Vlad was so determined to unite Westeros. After all, if humanity did not unite, humanity would fall. Chapter 23, Game of Thrones. Westeros, several weeks later. The sun had set behind the walls of King's Landing, casting the gardens into quiet stillness. There, seated alone, Ned Stark waited in silence, leaning uncomfortably on his new cane. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking with steady steps toward him. Their eyes met before a word was spoken. "You're in pain," said Cersei, her voice cold, her smile even colder as she observed him closely. Ned used his cane to slowly rise, the movement clearly causing him discomfort. "I've had worse, my lady," he replied, barely flinching. A gentle smile touched Cersei's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps it's time to return home." The South doesn't seem to suit you, she said, her gaze fixed on him. The air grew heavier. He didn't look away, his eyes deep and serious, already knowing what had to be said. I know the truth behind Jon Arryn's death, Ned stated, without hesitation. Do you really? She replied, raising an eyebrow, her face calm, though a flash of fear flickered in her eyes. Is that why you summoned me, Lord Stark, to pose riddles? At that moment, he noticed something on her face, a bruise, still dark purple across her cheek. Has he done this before? He asked, pointing at the bruise. She averted her eyes, fully aware of what he meant. Her tone was calm, but laced with defiance. Jaime would have killed him. My brother is worth 1,000 of your friends, she said with disdain. The accusation was clear, but Ned didn't waver. His gaze remained fixed. Your brother, or your lover? He asked bluntly. She smiled smugly, knowing he had struck a nerve. The Targaryens married for 300 years to keep their bloodlines pure, she answered with a proud glint. Jaime and I are more than siblings. We shared a womb. We came into this world together. We belong to each other. He frowned, unwilling to let her words go unanswered. My son saw you with him, he declared, relentless. Cersei looked at him for a moment before responding with unsettling calm. Do you love your children? She asked, as if the answer were obvious. With all my heart, Ned replied without hesitation. No more than I love mine, she countered, a flash of restrained fury in her voice. Silence fell between them. He wasn't willing to let it end there. And they're all Jaime's, Ned said firmly. She laughed, a bitter, cold laugh. Thank the gods. On the rare occasions Robert stumbles drunkenly into my bed, I finish him off in other ways. By morning, he remembers nothing, Cersei said, without a trace of shame. You've always hated him, he murmured, almost as a realization. Hated him, I worshipped him, she said with vehemence. Every girl in the Seven Kingdoms dreamed of him, and he was mine by oath. And when I finally saw him on our wedding day at the Sept of Baelor, slim, fierce, black-bearded, it was the happiest moment of my life. Then that night, he climbed on top of me, stinking of wine, did what little he could do, and whispered in my ear, Lyanna. Your sister was a corpse, and I was a living girl, and he loved her more than he ever loved me. The weight of those words cut deep, but Ned didn't show it. He responded coldly, when the king returns from his hunt, I'll tell him the truth. By then, you must be gone, you and your children. I don't want their blood on my hands. Go as far as you can, with as many men as you can. Because wherever you go, Robert's wrath will follow, he said, without mercy. Cersei didn't flinch, as though his words had no weight. Her face remained unshaken as she spoke. And what of my wrath, Lord Stark? She asked in a dangerous tone. You should have taken the realm for yourself. Jaime told me about the day King's Landing fell. He was on the Iron Throne, and you forced him off it. All you had to do was climb the steps. What a tragic mistake. I've made many mistakes in my life, but that was not one of them, he replied firmly. She laughed, but there was no joy in it. Her voice dripped with venom. Oh, but it was. In the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground, Cersei said with a defiant smile. She turned and walked away, leaving him there, watching her with a mix of caution and resignation. Sea of Grass, at the same time. Vlad had spent several days in bed, enjoying Daenerys's company and feeding the dragons. In truth, it had been something of a vacation, one he was deeply grateful for, as he hadn't had a moment's rest since arriving in this world. There had always been something to deal with, problems to solve, enemies to face, and above all, the looming threat of the Long Night, a threat he would have to defeat if he ever hoped to enjoy his immortality without concern. Now recovered, it was time to set the next phase of his plan into motion, conquering Slaver's Bay. Slaver's Bay was made up of 3 major cities, Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. All of them thrived on the slave trade, a practice deeply embedded in their culture and economy. Unlike the Dothraki tribes, these cities were fortified, equipped with organized armies, and ruled by wealthy, proud, and brutal elites. Historically, Vlad knew these cities had been founded long before the Valyrian expansion, by ancient empires and Giscari merchants who survived the fall of Ghis to Valyria's power. For centuries, their inhabitants had clung to slavery as a symbol of power, resilience, and tradition. Now, Vlad intended to rip that legacy out by the roots and replace it with something new. But before he could begin with Slaver's Bay, Vlad's first target would be Qarth. The city was immensely wealthy and backed by the House of the Undying. Vlad had no doubt that the House of the Undying would cause trouble if he didn't deal with them immediately. In the original timeline, the warlocks of Qarth had rushed to invite Daenerys with the intent of killing her and using her dragons as magical batteries to maintain their immortality. Truth be told, he was curious about the House of the Undying. They were the first and only vestige of magic that had remained active even before the passing of the Red Comet. Even with his book, Vlad knew that Valyrian magic, and magic in this world in general, was ritualistic in nature and highly unpredictable. For that reason, eliminating the Undying Ones ranked high on his priority list. Chapter 24, Conqueror. After Qarth, his next target would be Astaper. He needed the Unsullied army, but truthfully, he also wanted to free the slaves, partly as a strategic move, and partly because he knew it would make Daenerys happy. Despite everything, she still had a warm heart, and Vlad could see the pain in her eyes every time she witnessed the mistreatment of slaves, whether in Vaes Dothrak or even within her own Khalasar. Besides, considering that one of her missions was Breaker of Chains, the task would be an easy one. Yunkai, on the other hand, didn't require a war. Its walls were solid, but its rulers were merchants, not soldiers. Vlad didn't plan a long siege. He would arrive, make his offer to free all the slaves, and wait. If they were smart, they would comply. If not, they would burn. Meereen would be the last. Unlike the others, it was too large to fall through intimidation alone, but its size was also its weakness. The number of slaves vastly outnumbered their masters, and with the right pressure, a revolt would erupt from within. Vlad wouldn't need to lead it directly, he only had to ensure there were weapons in the right places and let the rumor of his support spread. Once the slaves took the city, the masters would be executed or expelled. Vlad would enter without resistance and establish a new order. The former slaves would take control, backed by his progeny, ensuring that Meereen wouldn't descend into chaos. Vlad had already sent his progeny to infiltrate each of the cities. Once he conquered them, his small council of men completely loyal to him would administer them according to his policies. His thoughts were interrupted when Dracul climbed up his leg onto the table where his map was spread, demanding attention. The incubation ritual had been far more complex than it appeared. It hadn't just allowed the dragons to be born, it had also created an empathic bond between him, Daenerys, and the creatures. It wasn't exactly telepathy, but they could sense, roughly, what the others wanted or needed. And right now, that little beast simply wanted its head scratched. Vlad didn't know if it was an effect of the ritual, but he found the behavior of these otherwise deadly creatures incredibly endearing. "One day, you'll be free to soar across the sky," he murmured with a faint smile as he stroked Dracul's head. The small dragon gave a whistling sound of apparent approval. Vlad wasn't sure if it truly understood him, but from what he could sense, all it wanted was for the praise to continue. The list was complete. He would conquer the cities, turn Daenerys, and claim that damn throne, before melting it down to forge a pair of proper, comfortable thrones for the king and queen. Vlad and his army of over 100,000 men advanced toward Qarth. The day began without incident. Vlad had awakened after a quiet night, enjoying the company of his wife, but he immediately sensed something was different. He couldn't pinpoint it right away, but the air felt changed. Even he himself. His body was stronger, his senses sharper, his powers enhanced, as though magic now responded to him more readily. He frowned and stepped out of his tent, seeking answers, until he saw it in the sky. The red comet had finally arrived, streaking across the heavens, its glow illuminating the morning with an ominous light. Vlad knew exactly what it meant. Magic, dormant for centuries, was awakening again. He also knew the Dothraki would see it as an omen, and he would not allow them to interpret the sign as they pleased. Before the comet reached its full glory in the sky, he summoned everyone. Both the free men and the slaves gathered, and with Daenerys at his side, he stood before his vast Khalasar. Behind him, the four dragons roared and beat their wings, impatient. The crowd gathered across the great plain, the sky tinged red by the comet. The wind stirred the manes of the horses and the banners of the Khalasars that had joined under his rule. Vlad stood at the center, mounted on his horse, Daenerys at his side, and the dragons roaring above, their shadows dancing over the sea of grass. His golden eyes scanned the people, those who now belonged to him, both riders and slaves. He raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Today marks the beginning of a new era," he proclaimed, his voice resonating across the plain. "The skies have spoken and shown us the way. And with it, we shall rise." A roar of approval rippled through the Khalasar, but Vlad wasn't finished. For centuries, the Dothraki have ridden without purpose, pillaging only for war and death. That ends today. He straightened in the saddle, his gaze burning like fire. We will not be a people forgotten by time. We will not be a mere whisper in history. The riders pounded their chests and shouted their war cries, but Vlad raised his hand once more to silence them. But I will not do this alone. I don't need slaves. Only the strong ride with me. Vlad raised his sword, pointing it toward the crowd. Today, before the gods and before all of you, I swear, there shall be no more slaves in my Kosar. Murmurs erupted through the crowd. Many slaves lifted their heads, disbelieving. Vlad looked at them directly. Those who wish to leave, may leave. No one will stop you. But those who stay, his voice thundered, will be my people. You will have homes, possessions, families, riches, and you will watch as I tear the chains off every slave in this world. The dragons roared in the sky, as if they understood the meaning of his words. Vlad took a deep breath before continuing. I swear by my blood that our tale will be written in fire and blood. We will be the storm that sweeps away the feeble kingdoms of greedy men. Our names will live forever, and I swear to you, here and now. He raised his sword toward the comet, shouting, I will be the stallion who mounts the world. The Kosars' roar was deafening. The riders raised their weapons to the sky. The slaves, who had known nothing but chains their entire lives, shouted with newfound strength. Beneath the shadow of the comet and the cries of dragons, Vlad would not simply conquer peoples, he would forge a new one, with fire and blood. Chapter 25, Let the World Burn. Back in their tent, Vlad entered first, with Daenerys close behind, her breath still quickened by the thrill of his speech. There was no doubt that what she had just witnessed had stirred something deep within her. Her violet eyes followed him intently as the fabric of the entrance fell shut behind her, cutting them off from the noise outside. Without a word, she stepped forward and kissed him with fierce passion, taking him by surprise. It wasn't a delicate kiss, it was hungry, desperate, as if she meant to devour the very essence of the man she had come to love. Vlad responded with equal intensity, wrapping her in his arms and pulling her against him. For a moment, there was nothing else but the fire of their lips, their shared desire, the certainty that together, they were unstoppable. When they finally pulled apart, Daenerys rested her forehead against his, her hands brushing over the edges of his war cloak. With a soft but resolute voice, she broke the silence. Were you serious? Do you really mean to free all the slaves? Vlad didn't hesitate. Of course. His tone held not a trace of doubt. I know you, Daenerys. I know what it does to you to see men in chains, to feel their pain, to hear their cries. I know how deeply it torments you, and that is why, he looked into her eyes, a fierce light burning in his golden gaze, I will end it. Daenerys stared at him, stunned by the absolute certainty with which he had spoken those words. For so long, she had believed no one could truly understand her yearning to break the chains of the enslaved, that she lacked the power to change anything, and she hadn't wanted to burden Vlad with her hopes. So she had kept it to herself. But Vlad had seen it. He had seen it, and changed everything. Her lips parted with a question she could barely contain. Are you doing it, for me? Vlad blinked, then suddenly burst into laughter, a low, guttural sound laced with outrage. Before she could react, he cupped her face in his hands with overwhelming intensity. His eyes burned like the fire of the comet. For you, he repeated, incredulous, as if the question itself were absurd. For you, my love, I would let the world burn. The silence that followed was thick as the night. Daenerys felt her breath catch, not from fear, but because in that instant, she understood what it truly meant to be with a man like Vlad. A man who didn't just love her, but would tear down empires and defy the gods for her. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She simply kissed him again. King's Landing. Edward Dracul moved like a shadow through the darkened corridors of the Red Keep. His elegant black garments absorbed the flickering torchlight, his steps were silent, his presence imperceptible to mortal eyes. He had been one of Vlad's first offspring, saved from hunger and slavery, gifted with a power he never could have imagined in his mortal days. In return, his lord had asked only for loyalty, and for him to gather information in King's Landing. Edward considered himself unworthy of such grace. So now, entrusted with a task of true importance, he would not let anything go wrong. It wasn't the first time he had moved through the Red Keep unseen. He slipped through it so often, he probably knew its halls better than the people who lived there. The stone stairs barely creaked under his weight as he ascended steadily toward the chambers of Ned Stark's daughters. In front of the door, 2 Lannister guards were speaking in low voices, unaware of the shadow descending upon them. Edward didn't even slow his pace. With a single glance and a whispered word, compulsion wrapped their minds like a choking mist. A flicker of confusion crossed their faces before, with mechanical movements, they drew their daggers and, without hesitation, drove them into their own throats. No screams, only a strangled gurgle as dark blood spilled across the floor. Edward pushed the door open with a sharp motion. The lock cracked and broke, and the door flew inward, startling the Stark sisters. Arya, ever instinctive, was already on her feet with a candlestick in hand, while Sansa brought a hand to her mouth, horrified by the sudden intrusion. "Who are you?" Arya demanded, placing herself in front of her sister. Edward showed no reaction. His eyes, dark as night, scanned the room coldly before settling on them. "There's no time," he said firmly. "Your father will be executed. After that, you'll be used to force the North to submit to Joffrey." Sansa felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. "No, that can't be," she whispered, shaking her head as if denial could undo reality. "You're lying." Arya clenched her fists. "My father is an honorable man. They can't kill him like a criminal." Edward looked at her with a mix of pity and impatience. "My lord will not allow the Lannisters to hold such power over the North," he continued calmly. "So I'm taking you out of here, my ladies. We're not leaving without our father," Arya growled, raising the candlestick. Edward turned his head to her and spoke a single word. Silence. The compulsion struck Arya like an invisible wave. Her body tensed at once, her mouth sealed shut, and the candlestick clattered to the floor with a dull thud. Her eyes widened with fury and helplessness, but her limbs no longer obeyed her. Sansa stifled a scream and rushed to her sister, shaking her. "What did you do to her? Leave her alone. Don't argue with me," Edward warned. "I don't have my lord's patience. Master Dracul wants you safe, not happy. Please, don't make me use force." "Dracul? You mean Vlad Dracul?" Sansa whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. "What does the demon of Essos want with the daughters of the Warden of the North? Why is he helping us?" Even in King's Landing, she had heard the stories of the monster from Essos. A call with the largest army ever seen, a man who could not be harmed, who impaled his enemies, who drank blood, who even had dragons. Edward felt a hint of satisfaction. Even in this filthy city, his master's name already inspired fear in men's hearts. Still, he held back his smile. With a swift motion, he pulled aside a rug and lifted a loose stone slab, revealing a narrow passageway descending into darkness. Without giving them a choice, he pushed Sansa in first, then Arya, who was still struggling against the compulsion. The stone closed behind them. Sansa felt the weight of the world pressing down on her as they moved through the tight corridor. Each step took her farther from her father. "Father," she whispered, voice breaking. Edward didn't stop. He wasn't there to save Eddard Stark from his own naivety.